On October the 30th, 2025, a JetBlue Airbus A320 suddenly pitched down mid-cruise, injuring several people on board.
We have a flight control issue. We've got at least 3 people injured.
And the most likely cause behind this upset turned out to be almost as surprising as the event itself. Was it possible that a single burst of solar radiation could cause a modern, highly redundant fly-by-wire aircraft to behave so dramatically, and therefore subsequently lead to the grounding of over 6,000 Airbus jets? Now, maybe more importantly, could this happen again, or has it already happened before? Well, initially, the event that triggered this story seemed like just another case of clear air turbulence, and therefore didn't get much real attention. It happened to JetBlue Flight 1230, departing from Cancun International Airport in Mexico, heading towards Newark Liberty International in the United States. The aircraft involved was an Airbus A320-200 with registration November 605 Juliet Bravo, and at the time it was 20 years old. Now, this is a relatively famous plane in JetBlue's fleet thanks to its Boston Red Sox special livery, and it has seats for 162 passengers, but we don't know exactly how many were actually on board this particular flight. Here, I should also stress that as we are recording this video, we don't yet have a preliminary report available on this incident. So the information in this video is based on initial statements by the airline, the NTSB, aviation authorities, as well as any available news reporting. But thanks to ATSB data, we know that JetBlue Flight 1230 took off normally from Cancun's runway 30 left around noon local time, and it then quickly turned north before climbing to flight level 350, which is about 35,000 feet. Now, normally the aircraft would have spent a bit over 2 hours at that flight level on its way over to Newark, but on this particular flight, the aircraft suddenly experienced a serious upset about 45 minutes into the flight. Flight tracking sites like Flightradar24 show that the aircraft all of a sudden pitched down into a descent rate of nearly 1,800 feet per minute, before pitching back up again to return back to its normal altitude. Now, this upset didn't last very long, only around 4 to 5 seconds, according to a later statement made by the NTSB. But according to various sources, the aircraft lost around 100 feet of altitude in that time, before regaining it back again. Now, that 1,800 feet per minute descent rate in itself doesn't actually tell us much. A descent rate from cruise altitude during a routine flight can often be higher than 2,000 feet per minute. But in this case, what matters is how suddenly the aircraft pitched down and then up again, which in this case was quite violent. And crucially, the autopilot also remained engaged during the entire event, which is important because under normal circumstances the autopilot would never make inputs leading to a sudden maneuver like that. Now, after the upset, the pilots first got into contact with their cabin crew to get a sense of just how bad things were, and after that they notified air traffic control that they needed diverting. They also added to that they would need medical support on their arrival because they now had several injuries on board, including 3 people who had suffered a laceration to the head. So the flight was subsequently diverted to Tampa International in Florida, where it landed safely on runway 01 left about half an hour after the upset. So in total, the flight lasted about 1 hour and 15 minutes. Now, the number of total injuries was a little bit unclear at first. Authorities in Florida stated that at least 15 people, including children, had to be taken to hospital, with other sources putting that number to between 15 and 20 people. About a week later, the NTSB clarified that in total there had been 10 people injured and that they were now investigating the event thoroughly. JetBlue also initially grounded the aircraft in Florida as they tried to figure out what had happened, but the plane didn't spend a lot of time there. Already on the 3rd of November, 4 days after the incident, it flew again, making a couple of non-revenue flights on that day and the next, before returning to a regular schedule on the 5th of November. So, what had actually happened? What was it that had caused this? Well, We now know that when JetBlue's engineers examined the plane, they determined that this upset had been caused by a computer called ELAC-2, which stands for Elevator Aileron Computer 2. This is one of several computers that the Airbus A320 relies on in order to stay safe in the air. The Airbus A320 family are what's known as fly-by-wire aircraft, which means that the inputs that the pilots make on their flight controls are first turned into electrical signals, which are processed through computers before then being turned into movements of the actual flight controls. Now, these computers essentially evaluate the control inputs of the pilots against Airbus's fly-by-wire flight control laws to make sure that the aircraft doesn't do anything unsafe. Like, for example, pitch down violently or unexpectedly because of a sudden input. In this case though, JetBlue's technicians were able to verify that the pilots of Flight 1230 did not make any such inputs. Instead, they saw that the ELAC-2 flight control computer had a fault, which had resulted in that uncommanded pitch-down movement. Now, the technicians couldn't find any other faults, so they just replaced the ELAC-2 computer, and after some extra testing, they returned the aircraft back to service again. But obviously, this story didn't end there. The airline, the regulators, and definitely Airbus really wanted to know how and why this had been possible. And about 4 weeks after the incident, we got our answer. On the 28th of November, Airbus released a statement saying that analysis of a recent event involving an Airbus A320 family aircraft has revealed that intense solar radiation may corrupt data critical to the functioning of the flight controls. Intense solar radiation? Now, I could try to explain that myself, but luckily I know someone who can definitely do that better than me. Alex from the awesome YouTube channel Astrum.
While from Earth it might seem pretty static, if you get up close or, a bit safer, look at it with a solar telescope, it quickly becomes clear that the Sun is a huge, swirling ball of plasma. Deep inside the Sun, its core is rapidly fusing hydrogen to helium, releasing so much energy that it reaches a staggering 15 million degrees Celsius at its heart. To put that in perspective, every 1.5 millionths of a second, the Sun releases more energy than the whole of humanity consumes in an entire year. This incredible amount of energy causes the Sun to throw off vast quantities of charged particles from its outer atmosphere, or corona, in what is known as the solar wind. Here, particles gain enough energy that they can escape the Sun's gravity and stream outwards along magnetic field lines, and towards us, at millions of kilometers an hour. It might sound violent, but this is normal for the Sun, and usually our atmosphere and our planet's magnetic field, known as the magnetosphere, shield us from the worst of the solar wind's effects. But every now and then, something even more violent happens. As plasma bubbles up on the surface of the Sun, it carries intense magnetic field lines that store energy. When these magnetic field lines concentrate in certain areas and suppress the flow of plasma, sunspots appear, before twisting, bursting, and releasing all that energy in a huge eruption. This can cause two types of outburst. Solar flares blast intense electromagnetic radiation into space, including X-rays and gamma rays, which particularly affect the ionosphere, or the upper charged layer of Earth's atmosphere. But also our radio communications. Coronal mass ejections, on the other hand, release high-energy particles that can damage electronic equipment and even induce currents in Earth's atmosphere, causing geomagnetic storms. And both of these can occur at the same time. Now, large-scale solar events are incredibly rare. There's perhaps only a handful every century, but they are more likely during certain periods of times than others. And that's thanks to the Sun's solar cycle. Every 11 years, the Sun reaches a so-called solar maximum, where its activity levels peak. During this time, there are more sunspots, and that means more flares and more CMEs. The most recent solar maximum was in October 2024, so although we are not at the very peak of solar activity right now, we are still in the middle of a relatively active period for the Sun. Sunspots are drifting across its surface, and flares are a weekly occurrence. If they happen to be directed at Earth, then we can see their influence ourselves without a telescope. The high-energy, charged particles of the solar wind are funneled to the poles by Earth's magnetic field, where they hit oxygen and nitrogen atoms in our atmosphere, exciting them and causing them to emit light. Green and red for oxygen, and blue, purple and pink for nitrogen. We see this on Earth as the aurora, a beautiful reminder of our Sun's awesome power. Now, back to Peter.
Thank you, Alex. Now, I would love to talk about the beauty of the auroras and what they look like in my hometown in northern Sweden, but let's instead go back to the Airbus A320 and see what kind of threat solar flares and cosmic radiation in general represent, specifically when it comes to aircraft avionics. But before we do, the very fact that software evidently can have this kind of impact is a great reminder that safety around digital systems is just as important as safety around mechanical systems. And also, the threats can come in many different forms. That's why I am so happy to have NordVPN as the sponsor for this video. Nord's Threat Protection Pro feature doesn't just hide your IP or let you bypass geo restrictions. No, it actively scans every website you visit and then blocks dangerous sites before they can become a problem. This means that phishing pages, malware, trackers and even some intrusive ads will all be blocked before they can even load. And another thing that I really love is that the Threat Protection Pro works even when you're not connected to a VPN server. So whether I am digging through aviation reports, reading forums or watching news, I know that I'm always protected, which is essential when you do research like my team and I do. Right now, NordVPN is offering you 4 extra months for free when you sign up for their 2-year plan. Just scan this QR code or head over to nordvpn.com/pilot, and remember, Nord always offers you a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you don't risk anything by trying. Thank you, Nord. Now let's get back to those solar flares. Now, in the same document where Airbus mentioned solar radiation for the first time, they also revealed that they had already released a document called an Alert Operators Transmission, or AOT. That document explained how this problem was to be solved and that regulators like EASA in Europe and the FAA in the United States would soon release Emergency Airworthiness Directives, or EADs, which would make these fixes mandatory. Now, as many of you will have heard by now, the solution that Airbus and the regulators adopted was to change the software of the elevator aileron computers, or ELACs, back to an older version. And before I explain the implications of this, I need to explain a little bit more about those Airbus flight control computers. You see, the Elevator Aileron Computer 2, or ELAC 2, that was swapped out in the JetBlue flight, is just one of a total of 7 computers used in the Airbus A320's fly-by-wire system. There are 2 ELACs, 3 SECs, or spoiler and elevator computers, and 2 FACs, for flight augmentation computers, who control the rudder and yaw damper. As I'm sure many regular viewers of this channel already knows, we really like redundancy in aviation, which explains why the Airbus has so many computers. And if you paid attention to the names of those computers, you might have noticed that there are some interesting overlaps there. For example, the acronyms ELAC and SEC both include the word elevator in them, and that's because the 2 ELACs and the 3 SECs can all control the elevators. In normal operation though, ELAC 2 handles the elevators and the horizontal stabilizer. Now, if anything would go wrong with ELAC 2, ELAC 1 can take over the elevator control using a different hydraulic system. And normally ELAC 1 does have some elevator control, but it is mostly used to handle the ailerons on the wings. But the redundancy in the Airbus fly-by-wire system doesn't stop at simply having 7 different computers. because in reality, each of these machines is actually two computers, or possibly more depending on your definition of a computer. You see, all of the flight control computers have two distinct channels. The command channel, that is executing the pilot's commands, and the monitoring channel, which is there to double check what the command channel is doing. Each of those two channels is a separate computer, with both of them being able to play both roles. And in at least some of the flight control computers, each of the channels could have more than one main computer chip or processor for additional redundancy. Now notice that I said could have more than one processor, because some of this information is old and the computers can evolve over time, which is also worth remembering here. Anyway, the idea with having two channels per flight control computer is that if the command and monitoring channels diverge significantly, well then that computer or pair of computers is basically cut off from the rest of the system, and the fly-by-wire controls are configured to run on the remaining computers instead. Then, on top of that, there is a final level of redundancy in the types of computer chips that are used in these computers. The two ELACs use different processors from the three SECs, so that if, despite super extensive testing, there is some type of vulnerability on one type of chip or processor, well, then the other computers won't be affected by it. Now, so far, we've been talking about hardware, meaning the physical computers, but what about the software then? Well, from what we have found, it seems that initially at least, each of these flight control computers were made with a built-in specific software version. If new software was then developed for a computer, it would be taken out of the plane and into the factory or service facility, where it would get its new software installed, as well as a new part number. But then in 2009, Airbus introduced a new data loading function for its A320 flight control computers, which allowed field-loadable software to instead be used for this type of updates. This meant that aircraft and flight control computers with the right configuration could now be updated by having an engineer in the cockpit connect a PDL, for portable data loader, containing the updated software, and then upload it directly to the computer, which was obviously much faster than doing a physical computer swap. So now that you have a general idea of what these Airbus computers and their software is like, let's go back to those beautiful auroras caused by solar radiation and how that can affect computers. Generally speaking, there are three kinds of failures that electronics can suffer due to cosmic radiation. The first is transient errors, also known as single event upsets or SEUs, which is what we suspect happened in this case. Then we have failures causing minor component damage, where the device still works, but not very well. And lastly, more serious failures causing permanent damage. When a single event upset or SEU happens, this basically means that the affected computer suffers from something known as a bit flip, where a 1 is turned into a 0 inside of the computer or vice versa. And in practice, the effect of that will be that data flowing through the computer stops or is corrupted in some random way temporarily. Of course, this is well known in the aviation and space industries. Since 2021, ICAO has been monitoring space weather to look out for possible problems like these, and since 2007, Airbus has reportedly specified that its suppliers should factor the effects of solar radiation into their designs. That was a timely decision, because in October of 2008, an Airbus A320 suffered a serious in-flight upset, which also included a sudden pitch-down maneuver that injured over 100 people. In that case, the fault was traced to an Air Data Inertial Reference Units, or ADIRU, but the investigators specifically mentioned single event effects, or SEEs, which is another name for SEUs, as a possible cause. Now, when it comes to hardware, the makers of computers can use shielding of some sort to protect against at least some forms of radiation. And obviously, the redundancy of having two computers cross-checking each other, like the command and monitoring channels that I mentioned, can also help with this. But how could a version of software be more or less vulnerable to this risk? Well, we can't really answer this question for sure without learning more from the investigators in the JetBlue upset. But it might be something like an unrelated change elsewhere in the software that affected the way that the command and monitoring channels compared each other's inputs. We just don't really know yet. The NTSB stated that the issue likely occurred during an ALAC switch change, meaning that the ALAC 2, which was deemed to be faulty, was passing control of the elevators over to ALAC 1 when it happened. So another possibility is that the software change somehow affected the way that this ALAC switch was handled. In any case, it's safe to assume that this isn't a software bug that affects the computer's main functions. And we can say that because out of the 6,000 aircraft that were affected by this software change, only one developed this specific fault on this one specific flight. But was it really caused by solar radiation? Well, one detail in this story that wasn't mentioned in many reports was that on the day of the incident, there wasn't actually a lot of intense solar radiation going on, as Airbus put it. There are many space weather watchers out there, and on the 30th of October, when this JetBlue flight was making its way north, there wasn't anything special going on in terms of solar radiation. At least not according to Keith Ryden, Professor of Space Engineering at the University of Surrey in the UK. In their statements, Airbus also didn't confirm that solar radiation definitely caused the JetBlue upset. What they said was that instead the investigation had identified a vulnerability of the relevant software and hardware in case of exposure to solar flares. So whether or not solar flares actually did cause the JetBlue upset, this vulnerability obviously needed to be taken care of. And it was. EASA's Emergency Airworthiness Directive split the world's Airbus A320 family fleet into two, Group 1 and Group 2 aircraft. Group 1 were the affected aircraft whose ALAC B hardware had software version L104, and Group 2 aircraft were all of the others, like those that had previous versions of the software installed or that had a different kind of ALAC installed. The airlines then had to change the software of those ALAC B computers from version L104 back to L103+, or if those computers were non-downloadable, the computers themselves had to be changed. Now the regulators also immediately grounded all Group 1 aircraft, which was about 6,000 planes worldwide, and the airlines were allowed to ferry the planes to a different location if they needed that for the update, but only without passengers in non-ETOPS operations and with no more than 3 flights per plane. This obviously sounds really dramatic, but fortunately in most cases the mitigation of the problem was pretty simple. A software update or backdate using those portable data loaders that I talked about before in the cockpit. But around 1,000 jets needed the other, more time-consuming option, replacing ALAC B computers altogether. And that meant physically accessing these computers in the avionics base of the aircraft, unbolting them and then installing new ones in their place, if there were any available. And this probably explains why some sources said that restoring the aircraft to service took around 2 hours, whilst others said that it was just a 15-minute affair. Either way, let's spare a thought for all of the hundreds of engineers and ground crew around the world who had to spend most of the weekend between Friday the 28th of November and Monday the 1st of December crawling in and out of Airbus aircraft in order to frantically try to update all of them and get them back into service as soon as possible. And this was something that likely wasn't helped by the fact that this was the weekend after Thanksgiving in the United States. In any case, many airlines were able to get practically all of their planes back on schedule before the weekend was over. American Airlines, United, Delta, Air India, Jetstar in Australia all seemed to have resumed normal operations by Saturday or Sunday. But other airlines were a little bit less lucky. Avianca and JetBlue still had to cancel flights even after Monday, and those worst affected were likely the airlines who had more planes needing an actual hardware replacement. All in all though, this vulnerability and the Emergency Airworthiness Directive that followed gave many airlines and ground personnel a few sleepless nights. And that's because of something that may or may not have actually caused that incident on the JetBlue flight 1230 4 weeks earlier. But this is exactly the kind of attitude that our industry should have if a possible problem is discovered which looked like it might have safety implications. If there's a doubt, there is no doubt. We just get it fixed. Now, one final concern here is that more modern computers run on chips with architectures measured in only a few nanometers. That means that they're now nearly as small as the cosmic particles that are bombarding them, and that means that future aircraft avionics could well face more challenges during solar activity than older systems. And therefore, they might need greater shielding, redundancy, or other mitigation strategies. But what do you think? Should Airbus have handled this situation differently, or do you see any other threats in here? Let me know in the comments here below. And I also want to send a huge thank you to Alex and his team for helping out with this video. Now, I also hope that you have all seen that we have upgraded our merch shops recently and also created these awesome airport posters from around the world. Check out if your favorite airport is there, and if it's not, let us know and we might add it in our next batch. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.